Summer of 2020, the quarantine year. In late July, I was hiking with a friend along the Rio Chama. Although we were just on the other side of the river from town, the railroad was not running, the campground was closed, and the majority of the town was empty. This was a short day hike, as we are seniors. We had a dog accompanying us, a pit bull mix, for part of the way. Before we reached the river, we had to return the dog to the car. She became unusually excitable and fearful. Note, my friend and the dog live up in the mountain, and the dog is used to wildlife and has treated a bear before. Anyway, windows down and dog much happier, we returned to our walk. We had crossed the river, and we were on the trail that runs by the bank. This is when we first heard a series of hollow knocking sounds. These were loud and resonant, not woodpeckers or falling branches. A short time later, they were repeated at a distance, the knocks sounding lighter in tone, like a hit on a more solid wood. The knocks close to us responded, and we decided that it was in our best interest to leave the area. What myself and my brother-in-law found was a structure built of mainly blackberry vines. We were scouting for deer on an abandoned farm in an area that had been stripped for coal 35 years prior. This was by the Putney Ridge, actually not too far away from Cambridge in Ohio. Deer here were plentiful, but not as much as present day. When came across it, when we both were following a path that materialized and split in two directions around a spoiled bank. My brother-in-law went one way, and I the other. Both paths lead to the top of the spoil, where we came on the structure. We were in total amazement, noting it was some kind of igloo shape with an opening to enter. The briars were woven together to form the walls, and the inside had been cleared, like it had been mowed. We stood amazed at what could have made it. We had never heard much about a Bigfoot at the time. Nobody in their mind would have been in the area fighting thorny vegetation, biting insects to create such a thing. Then, about a month later, the same brother-in-law and his cousin were walking out of a hollow near dark when they heard the strangest animal they'd ever heard. When they would try and tell the family about it, they just got laughed at. Neither ever forgot it or entered the property in the dark. It wasn't until maybe 20 years later when I happened on a Bigfoot program, showing such a structure that a bell went off as to what we'd seen. Also, around the time, other people had reported seeing things peeking in windows around the county. Very strange sightings, if you ask me. This took place in North Carolina, Haywood County. Take 19 west out of Maggie Valley. Turn right on top of mountain towards Blue Ridge Parkway. Turn left on Parkway towards Cherokee. Past first, pull off to the left to turn to Balsam Mountain Road. Towards Mason Monument. Before Monument, there's a pull off to the right where we were. Just before that, there's also a pull off to the left, and the woods to the left. That is where the sound came from. So, Barb and I travel the road off the Blue Ridge Parkway to this trail several times a week when it is open. We are flower and wildlife junkies. Approximately 1 year ago, we were at the pull-off just before the Masonic marker, looking at fire pink flowers, when out of the blue, there was 3 tree knocks from across the road. Very loud and very distinctive. There was nobody else around whatsoever. No wind either. We have noticed rocks that have fallen down the mountain and landed on the roadway, but no sign of where they had come from. Also, just as an article in the hot sheet, the sighting occurred after sunset, May 30th, near the Masonic marker at Balsam Gap Camp, just off the Blue Ridge Parkway near Maggie Valley. It was getting very cold, so we got in the car, cranked the car up, and started back up to leave, when this very dark figure ran across the road into the woods. It looked like a man. The hairs on my arm and back of my neck stood up, and I have never been so afraid in my life. Like I said, this was from an article. Pretty scary. Obviously something lives around here. Well, I had a possible sighting today in the Shawnee National Forest. Not by me, sadly, but my wife. And believe it or not, she wasn't even a believer. Anyway, we were driving around from campground to campground, trying to find a spot to set up. Drove to campground called Camp Cadiz. All campsites were occupied there, so we drove down this old road. It became too muddy to go any further, so we decided to turn around. And as I was dodging big potholes filled with water, we came around this bend, and she catches out of the corner of her eye, and she screams, "Babe, don't hit that!" And I'm like, "What?" Of course, I see nothing there, but she says there was something coming out of the woodline trying to cross the road, but rein back in. She says it was black and brown, upright, and extremely large and tall. She says she still doesn't believe Bigfoot exists, but she knows she saw something she can't explain. This investigation was reported via phone, and the eyewitness gave his best to recollect the events that occurred on March 27th, 2021, between 8 to 8:30 a.m. Prior to this event, he never gave a thought to a skunk ape or Bigfoot being anything other than folklore. On the morning of March 27th, he was preparing breakfast with his wife. The kitchen has a window that looks across their backyard. When he turned to ask his wife a question, movement outside the window caught his eye. He saw a dark bipedal figure walk from a group of trees toward a wooded area before disappearing from his line of sight. Now, he asked his wife if she had seen that, just as his 8-year-old granddaughter came running from the dining room, yelling, "Grandpa, did you see that?" She had seen the figure as well from the back sliding glass door. She described it as big, and he admits that at first wondered what his neighbor was wearing, but realized it was taller than his 6'4" neighbor. He went on to describe the figure that was about 50 feet away, a slim build but tall. It was walking west to east, left to right, as they were looking north out the window. The family is very credible as to what happened that morning. It was obviously something they'd never seen, witnessed, or experienced before. When researching this area, it is not necessarily an area that one would expect to have this sort of activity. However, the homes are spaced out on 1 acre, or more lots, in some heavily wooded areas. His backyard connects to the Minnesota Scrub Reserve, which connects to agricultural and green areas, and then a state forest. Much of that area at the time of this sighting was very dry, without having had substantial rain for many months, which may have driven this animal towards water, and in this case, Forked Creek, which is across the street from this man's home. My son and I had just finished watching the sunset on the Blue Ridge Parkway at the Masonic Marker. We were still there watching the overview as a fog was rolling in. It was getting very cold, so we got in the car, cranked the car up, and started to back up and leave when this dark figure ran across the road into the woods. It looked like a man, but I turned towards the figure and couldn't see anything. It was entirely too large to be a black bear, and most definitely was not an elk. I haven't seen any at all this weekend. Again, the figure was very dark. The hairs on my arm and the back of my neck stood straight up. I've never been so afraid. My son reported seeing a large, two-legged figure covered in fur at approximately 8:30 p.m., July 18th, 2021, while driving eastbound on Pleasant Hill Road, roughly 1.5 miles west of Highway 164 in Richfield, Wisconsin. The figure was standing right next to a tree on the south side of the road, close to the shoulder. The road here is curvy. He said he also caught eye shine, and the eyes were large. He said he probably saw this for about 3 seconds while driving. His headlights caught this, and he is 100% positive he saw something. He told me his heart dropped. He immediately called me while still driving. I knew something unique had happened based on his demeanor and tone. About 45 minutes after he called me, I met him at home and we went back to the site with him. We brought our dog. Every time we stopped or approached this area where the sighting was, he began to whimper and would not get any closer. Something really spooked him. At around 11 p.m. on July 26th, my wife and I were night fishing on the backwater of Crane's Nest River in Dickinson County, Virginia. My wife's head was hurting, so she decided to take a nap. We had heard something large walking in the woods, but just wrote it off as a bear or deer, as both are plentiful in our area. She had been asleep for about an hour when I heard a large knock, about 50 yards up in the tree line. About 20 seconds later, several hundred yards up in the ridge, there was yet another knock. Both sounded as if somebody had taken a 4x4 post and struck a tree with it. Then, about 10 minutes later, there was a splash in the water about 20 feet away from our boat. This splash sounded like something weighing 20 or 30 pounds had struck the water, waking my wife. It's not unusual to hear large fish jumping at night, but this was different. After the splash, no more than a couple of minutes had passed, and there were 2 more knocks, and they were closer than the first one. We pulled anchor, reeled in our lines as we were leaving. We heard 2 more knocks. My wife told me she heard the knocks up on the ridge, but I didn't hear those. Just the sound of a large animal walking up the river, the same way we were traveling, as if it was following us. When it came to a shallow cove where it would have had to swim through, we stopped hearing the walking sounds. This is the second time we encountered this animal. We also had an experience about a month and a half earlier, as we heard a large animal walking around and big splashes in the water, as if it were throwing things at us that night as well. Very strange